Hello and welcome to Psychological Insights. Today's topic is negative will. We spoke about it last month. It's a construct that is not used in psychology today commonly, but it is a psychological construct that psychologists know about. Our guest, of course, is Dr. Robert Hamm. He's an expert in all things psychological. In fact, he did write a paper on negative will in 2009. So this is part 2. I'm Pat Kazakoff. Stay with Hello, Dr. Hamm.
Morning, Pat.
How are you?
Right. How are you doing today on this kind of a very rainy day, but it's welcome. We've had some beautiful weather. Can't complain.
Well, let's not be too negative about the day.
Very funny.
Trying to be funny. So we're talking about negative will, and I mentioned that we talked about it last month, but just for a little refresher course, why don't we define negative will again?
Well, this is a concept that was introduced by a psychologist who was a colleague of Freud's. His name was Otto Rank, R-A-N-K, and it was influenced by his readings of Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher. So will is not a construct that is used very much. It's antiquated, not by psychology, not even by philosophy, I don't think. And it pertains to how Rank intended it to mean. He worked with a lot of artists, that is his patients, and many of his patients had difficulty believing in themselves. So as a therapist, he called his therapy will therapy, was to help his patients to regain or to gain, maybe for the first time in their lives, sufficient confidence in themselves, even though they were different. They were artists. They were different. You have to have a lot of courage to put yourself out there. And so Rank believed that this is something that Freud, who was a colleague of his, psychology was missing and needed to be addressed. Rank believed that what was missing in Freud's analysis was self-acceptance, embracing oneself, where Freud would break down his patients' free associations and analyze them and interpret them as representing defenses. So according to Freud, a patient doesn't really know what's troubling them. They need an analyst to decipher their symptoms, and so a patient cannot really trust their experience in that way. You need someone to decipher. Well, Rank believed that this was actually making people worse. That when you start to question the validity of your experience, it only compounds whatever self-doubts you have that prevent you from embracing yourself, accepting yourself. And so this is the foundation of his will therapy. The negative will is when one does not accept oneself, one does not believe in oneself. And so one is riddled with self-doubt. You don't believe your experience. Sort of like the children's story of the emperor's new clothes. The emperor is riding through the streets. They say he has new clothes, and of course we all know the story. He has nothing on, but everybody agrees and believes that the emperor really does have new clothes. So we relinquish our trust in our own senses, our own perceptions.
Another way of saying that is you don't trust your instincts. Would that be fair?
More than instincts, it's your perceptions, your experience itself. So Ronk believed that Freudian analysis actually makes many people worse rather than better because it makes them more self-conscious and to question their experience. And Ronk felt that this was part of the problem that leads a lot of people to therapy, is they don't trust themselves, they don't believe in themselves. So his therapy was devoted to, that's the negative will. His therapy was devoted to helping support people in believing in themselves. Now, my paper in 2009 extends Ronk's application to other kinds of disorders, some of whom are people who do go into therapy, who fit in a different end of the spectrum of mental disorders, known as the cluster B personality disorders or narcissistic and other variants of narcissism disorders.
So I just want to translate that for the public. So we're talking about Otto Rank was an acolyte of Freud's, and he broke away. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
And Freud's analysis was more about adaptation to the world, that you have to adapt to the world in order to have a civilized world, whereas Rank's concept was no, that you have to self-actualize from within. And that's a different way of looking at the world. And what you're telling me now and what I'm hearing is that people went more with the Freudian than they did with the Rank.
That's all true. Yeah. Very few people know who Otto Rank was. Of course, Freud's very famous, as you said. Yes, Freud did believe, Freud was more of a pessimist. Freud believed that the best we can do is to be neurotic, that there's a price we pay to live in a civilized world. Whereas Rank believed that, no, he believed that we should embrace ourselves and allow our potentials to unfold. And this is a very Nietzschean idea because Nietzsche is very famous for his Superman or Superman concept, which was very provocative because Nietzsche was a critic of Western civilization, that Western civilization sort of squelches the human will.
I find it very interesting also that that Freudian psychology is based on a psychologist, whereas Otto Rank's theory is based on a philosopher, on a philosophical theory, on Nietzsche. So that's quite
right.
Unusual, I
It
would
is.
think.
Well, when he was trained, when he went to graduate school, this is over 100 years ago, well, psychology was different. He was an Austrian, so he went to school at the University of Vienna. Psychology was a fledgling field, and it was more philosophical than scientific as it is today. And you're right, Rank was a very, he was existential in his theoretical approach. Freud had important elements of existentialism in his psychology, but he was much more clinical. The way that he looked at human problems was more from a diagnostic point of view, which is more judgmental, whereas Rank was much more embracing of people and their problems. And sort of the existentialist approach to psychological problems is that all problems are universal rather than, oh, well, you have a disorder, so to speak. So if you don't see yourself in terms of what's wrong with you, but rather as something that is human, you're more inclined to feel more accepting of part of yourself, including the problems. So that's a more existential way of looking at mental disorders.
The other thing that I'm noticing in reading some of the literature is that there's a lot of talk of power politics and power and identity, which I don't recall reading when I read about Freud.
Yes, that's my contribution, if you will. That's my
idea. That's interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that when I have given thought, it's been several years since I wrote that paper published in the Psychoanalytic Review, but when I've given it more thought, it does break down to how takes us closer to Nietzsche, because Nietzsche's concept of the will was all tied into power. Um, if you embrace yourself, you embrace your will. So there's a relationship between identity and the will, and the will. People have different philosophers have had different ways of construing what the will is, but to a large extent, and certainly for Nietzsche, it has to do with power. Now, that doesn't mean willpower necessarily per se, or power over other people. In fact, that's what the negative will is, when our power is directed to prevent other people from exercising or embracing their will. So this is how I apply the negative will concept beyond how Rank applies it to narcissistic disorders. So the neurotic, so there's two ends of the personality disorder. That's what when I say mental disorders, my focus is on personality disorders specifically.
I wanted to interject one more thing. Now that I know that it's this concept of power and identity is your contribution, and I know this is just an opinion, but why was Freud so popular? Like, he's popular now, and how come Otto Rank is not? I know that's an opinion, but can you posit a theory of why one took off and the other one did not?
Well, first of all, not everyone would agree with you. Most people in psychology, many people in the general public, believe that Freud is very passe. you know, we move well beyond Freud at this point, but certainly he's, famous. He's that popular. Everyone knows who Freud is, even though he is um, assailed in psychology as non-scientific. But to answer your question, I think that a couple of things. Freud was the founder of psychoanalysis, and Rank was one of his followers and members of his inner circle. So he was the founder, and he was famous even when he was alive. He wrote some very popular books, The Interpretation of Dreams, that the general public read. So Freud was very famous, partly because he was writing about really sexy topics, dreams and sex and jokes and
we like that. We like those topics.
Things that people, when he was, at the top of his career, when he was living, he was popular. He wasn't just known in professional circles. He was popular. He was writing bestsellers.
Got it. Sagan now, like that kind of popularity.
I don't who?
Francis Sagan, isn't that a well-known astronomer or writing books about astronomy?
I don't know. I don't know.
Well, obviously not that popular. Not popular enough.
I don't know astronomy well enough, but
or Shakespeare. Yeah. That would be a better example. Like, Shakespeare was popular in his time, and he's still popular now.
Yeah, it would be someone who would write, a self-help book today. That's very popular. I can't think of any offhand. There's millions of them, of course. So that's one reason. Another is that Rank was very, he was vilified by the psychoanalytic community. I won't get into the reasons. Politics had a lot to do with that. And his writings were very, very difficult to understand. He was a poor writer. So, a lot of his books are obscure. But his ideas were seminal, and they were the inspiration for Carl Rogers and others in the human potentials movement in the mid 20th century that really paved the way for modern psychology as it is today. But Rank is not given credit for it. he's been forgotten for those reasons. So I
So,
hope that answers your question.
well, um, I'm I'm thinking I was told that William James was the founder of modern psychology. Am I incorrect in that assumption?
Yeah, I suppose arguably there are many people who are founders. William James was an American, so his approach to psychology was very different than Freud and Rock. He was not psychoanalytic. Um, Americans did not take to psychoanalysis until um, many of the analysts who were in Europe had to flee Europe because of the Nazi Holocaust. And that's what popularized psychoanalysis here in the United States. Um, so James was a great psychologist in his time, but and considered one of the founders, but he was a different sort of
So
different.
let's move on and talk about personality types. Um, Talk about personality types from the perspective of Otto Rank.
Yeah, I just want to say something, get back to something, a very important construct you brought up, Pat, and that is power.
Power. Okay.
Yeah, that,
Back to power.
yeah, I'm sorry, I don't get confused. I'll get to the types, because that is really the focus of my work, personality. But I am writing about this partly because this concept of negative will, I feel, is very, very relevant to the world we live in today. I feel that the world is in turmoil right now in different ways. We're facing some very real existential crises. Um, I don't want to get into it. I'm not a political scientist or pundit by any means, but I am concerned. And I want to address it from a psychological standpoint. So my blog, our topic that we did several months ago on the malice, apathy, and the meaning of psychological health in a shrinking world is an attempt to address that. And so is this concept of the negative will. There is a very disturbing trend throughout the world, and especially here in the United States, towards fascism right now. And fascism is a political system that is founded on power, raw power, that isn't restrained by the principles that this country and many nations have been founded on, which is based on the Enlightenment principles of equality and democracy. And I think this is a very serious, not just me, but many people would agree, or it's under threat right now. And the concept of negative will really gets to the heart of that. It's a psychological construct which has to do with how we see ourselves and our relationships with others that is opposed to democracy and egalitarianism. And part of its source is a lack of empathy, a lack of inclusiveness, um, a lack of openness to the other. So those people who are most susceptible to this, not everyone, you don't have to have a mental disorder, would fit under, would have qualities that would fit under this construct of negative will, where there is a sort of a divided self, if you will, that is not based on empathy, but based more on fear and distrust, and either disparaging of the qualities of other people, a lack of openness, or just the opposite, not believing in oneself and therefore identifying with a leader who's charismatic and who usurps power of the people and their ability to make decisions for themselves, with the promise of offering security and delivering them from whatever ills that charismatic leader is identifying as the source of their problems.
By coincidence, I was at a meeting last night and I met a psychologist and I asked him the question, um, how are the problems now different from 10 years ago? And he's been a psychologist like you for many, many years. And he said to me, I mean, he didn't have the same explanation that you had, but what he said was that the problems are different now because we're in a world that's unsettled. And he used the word unsettled. And I said, well, what does unsettled mean? What does that mean? He says all these problems, the inflation, the politics, not winning the election, the Trump business, the weather, the climate control. He says this people are living in an atmosphere of unsettledness. And so this just leads towards different types of problems. I mean, I think he said what you're saying, but just in a different way. I found it quite interesting that he used that word unsettled.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is not an opinion of mine. I think it's a reality. I can tell you, I know people I talk to are very concerned and worried and upset and unsettled, if you will. And it's not a neurosis, it's a reality. It's not a distortion. It's something that I have never seen in my lifetime to this extent by any means.
That's what he mentioned also. He had the
Oh, yeah.
same perspective that it's a whole different kettle of fish. You have the same normal personality problems, but they're now in this different atmosphere. And so
Yes.
they show up differently.
So what's happening in the world is there's a lot of distrust and divisiveness. And so there's, with more wars and more climate change, there's going to be more refugees and people who are going to be migrating. And there's going to be, therefore, more xenophobic kinds of reactions, fear, that your values and your lifestyle are threatened. And so other people become the enemy, they become alienated and a threat. So this all stirs up the negative will, because it's based on that.
I mean,
So,
it makes sense to me what you're talking about. It
yeah.
just makes sense. It seems to be quite commonsensical.
So this divided sort of psyche that I think that is associated with personality disorders, in my opinion, because I'm introducing an idea, an existentialist notion, negative will, and proposing to the field of psychology that this is the concept that we should found our understanding of what a personality disorder is, rather than how it's traditionally been conceptualized in a more clinical and descriptive way.
Right. This is a more world, it's a more world perspective, that it's
Yes,
not just about the person, but it's about the world that he lives in and how he relates to that world.
yes. So in my paper on this topic, I propose that there's a parallel process here between what happens in the world on a broad scale, sociologically, politically, is a parallel to what goes on in the psyche of an individual who is disturbed as far as their, their personality, a personality disorder is concerned. I'm proposing that this is the source of personality disorders. And so in answer to your question about personality types, I'm proposing that all the different types, and there are three categories of personality disorders, clusters A, B, and C. There are many types that fit underneath those categories. So cluster B would be the narcissistic disorders, narcissistic personality, antisocial, sadistic personality. Cluster C would be what I call the neurotic disorders, which would be the dependent and the avoidant and the masochistic. And then cluster A are the odd types, the schizoid and the schizotypal and the paranoid. So in the DSM, in psychiatry, they're descriptive. There's nothing theoretically to bind them together. And so my model that was published in 2009 suggested that we create a theoretical foundation for this. And my proposal is that it should be existential in nature, the negative will. And so of all of these different types, I'm suggesting that we anchor the spectrum of personality disorders. It is sort of like a bipolarity between the neurotic and the narcissistic disorders. And with respect to the negative will, the narcissistic disorders are those people who embrace power and they parasitize power from others. That is, that they take power from others, either through force or deception or disinformation, which is rampant today in the world. And it is one of the key elements that describes what a person with a narcissistic type personality does. That is, that they use lies and deception in order to gain power over others. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the neurotic types, and those are the people who Ronk was addressing, who don't believe in themselves, that they don't believe in their experience, so they're more likely to be conforming, self-doubting, they lack self-confidence. And they are very susceptible to the narcissistic types. And here at writ large in society, here we have the phenomenon of how charismatic leaders and cult leaders and gain power. That they have some kind of promise that they offer. They give an explanation. Somebody's to blame. They find a scapegoat, and they find a population. Or we live in a world where there's a lot of unrest, and for whatever reasons, inflation, loss of jobs, loss of prosperity, refugees, you name it. They look for someone to deliver them and save them. And they find a charismatic leader who says, "Those are the people who are to blame. This group, this political group, this ethnic group." And they said, "That's it. Let's get on board." So this is sort of like the neurotic, narcissistic dynamic writ large in society.
I'm just hoping that it doesn't go that way, because I'm hearing, I'm hearing a future that's very, very bleak, and I don't want to hear that, because it doesn't work in my better interest to hear such a bleak future. And it also speaks to a future where I have no control, that I can't control, because I can't control all these outside factors.
Well, it is dark. I agree, but we cannot confront these problems like ostriches with our heads in the sand. It behooves us, doesn't it, to identify what the world's problems are, so that we aren't hurtling towards this kind of dystopia, if you will.
Well, this ostrich is going to take her head out of the sand, and hoping that that the bird on the other side, which is you, Dr. Hamm, will somehow come up with a solution to this dilemma, and that we're not going to have to suffer through this. I'm worried for my kids. I'm worried for our grandkids. Yeah. I mean, none of this works for the future. So hopefully next time when we meet, we'll have a little more positive take on this. But I'm counting on you, Dr. Hamm, to give some insight. You've certainly given a lot of insight into this topic, and it's an important topic. It's an important for our public to hear and to consider in their thought process. So thank you once again.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you again.
Enjoy. Okay.
You too. Bye-bye.